In this lesson, we're going to go over the traditional elements of battery and assault. We'll start with battery first, kind of establish what these elements are, then we'll talk about assault, establish what these elements are, and kind of as we go through it, it'll be important for us to try to distinguish some of the differences and some of the similarities between these two torts, because oftentimes when we're analyzing battery and assault in torts fact patterns, they can get really interwoven and sometimes it can be confusing to delineate between the two. So we'll try to kind of cover that as well as we go through this, so we're able to quickly distinguish between what battery looks like and what assault looks like on a torts fact pattern. But with that, we can just jump right into the intentional tort of battery, kind of go into what the elements are traditionally. So here we say the intentional tort of battery occurs when the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff's person with the intent to bring about harmful or offensive contact to another. So again, one quick note to make here before we jump into these, just as a big picture refresher, taking a step back for a second. If we think back to our first lesson on intentional torts, when we went over the essential elements of almost all intentional torts, the prima facie case, remember we said there was three essential elements. We had the voluntary act requirement, the intent requirement, and the causation requirement. We'll see that those three essential elements are baked into these intentional torts, right? When we look at battery, we start with causation, then we go into the voluntary act requirements, and then we have intent, right? Same thing with assault. If we peek over at assault real quick, we see our first element is the essential element of causation. The second and third are going to be our voluntary act requirements, and then we'll wrap up with the intent requirement. And so it is notable that I've organized the elements for these intentional torts intentionally this way so that we do have this consistency where we always start with causation first, then we go into the voluntary act requirements, and then we go into the intent requirement last. Right? This is the way that I've chosen to organize these intentional torts. I find this to be the best way to approach these for law school exams and the bar exam. So this is the way that I've just stylistically organized these elements. If you get on Google or start looking at treatises and you're like intentional tort battery elements, you might see a different organization or slightly different wording. It's probably all the same thing, right? It's probably all getting at the same basic ideas. It doesn't matter what order you talk about the elements in. You know, if you have slightly different wording, the generally accepted principles of law, when we're thinking about the traditional elements of battery, assault, and really all of the intentional torts we're going to talk about, stay the same, right? And I'll even talk about some of the differences here with some of these elements between, you know, the second restatement, third restatement, and kind of the majority and minority of jurisdictions, how it could play out differently. But for the most part, right, these are the traditionally accepted, you know, principles of law for these intentional torts. So don't get tripped up on the organization of the elements if it's slightly different than something else you're looking at. You know, students tell me this all the time. I promise it's probably, you know, the exact same thing. We've just switched the order up a little bit. And by the way, you might see it organized this way. I'm not like claiming that I invented this. Like, I'm sure somewhere else the elements look similar to this. Okay. So small disclaimer, because I do know sometimes one of the difficulties for law students is, you know, every source is slightly different and sometimes that can be confusing. But oftentimes when I actually look at it, it's more similar than students think. But with all of that, we can just get into it, right? The intentional tort of battery, let's get into the traditional elements. The intentional tort of battery occurs when the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff's person with the intent to bring about harmful or offensive contact to another. Let's start with the first element, which is causation, right? With all of our intentional torts, we'll want to make sure that the defendant is actually the legal cause of the plaintiff's harm. This is critical, right? We have to make sure that our defendant is the legal cause of the plaintiff's harm. Good news is, in intentional torts, this is usually pretty easy to see. If we think about a very classic battery, right, think about two guys in a bar fight where we have our defendant gets angry at the plaintiff, balls his hand up into a fist, pulls back, swings, makes contact with the plaintiff, and that contact causes injury. In that case, there's not going to be any causation issues, right? Very clearly there, the defendant is the legal cause of the plaintiff's harm. He's balling his fist up, he's punching the plaintiff, that's causing injury. There's no causation issues there. We can just move on to the next element. And that's actually most of the time what causation looks like in intentional torts. When we get to negligence, we'll see causation can be this huge, complicated issue. But intentional torts, it's usually more straightforward. There can be situations where we have multiple factors contributing to the harm. And the question there will be, well, was the defendant the substantial factor or a substantial factor in bringing about the harm? Take, for example, a situation where the defendant wants to harm the plaintiff by creating a trap and luring the plaintiff into the trap. So let's say the defendant goes out in the middle of the day into the woods and he digs a hole in the ground somewhere and he covers the hole with leaves and brambles and brush to kind of hide the hole. And his plan is he's going to go get the plaintiff and he's going to lure the plaintiff into the hole. And the plaintiff's not going to see the hole because it's covered by these leaves and he's going to fall in and sustain injury. Right? This is what the defendant's plan is. So say our defendant goes out into the woods and he digs the hole, right? And he starts to cover it with leaves and brush, whatever he can find to hide the hole. And let's say some time passes, and as time passes, the wind blows, and the wind blows even more leaves onto the hole, and this hides the hole even more. And say it goes from daytime to nighttime, and when night falls, because of the visibility without light, that falls, so the hole becomes harder to see. So now we have all these factors contributing to the potential harm of the plaintiff, right? So say the plaintiff comes in the middle of the night and falls into the hole and sustains injury. Well, we have these other factors now, right? The defendant could say, hey, look, I'm not the only cause of this harm, right? The wind blew more leaves on, which made it harder for the plaintiff to see. It became nighttime. It was harder for the plaintiff to see where he was going because it was dark outside, right? Maybe if it was light outside, the plaintiff wouldn't have fallen into this hole. So I'm not the only cause. The question's going to be whether the defendant was a substantial factor in bringing about the harm, not whether he was the only cause, right? And that's why we kind of have this substantial factor test for this very reason. When there's multiple factors contributing, the question will be, well, was the defendant a substantial factor? And there, where we see the defendant digging the hole, putting brush over it, and then luring the plaintiff into the hole, he's clearly a substantial factor. Even though there might have been some other factors that contributed to the harm, as long as the defendant was a substantial factor, we can say he was the legal cause of the plaintiff's harm, which satisfies this first causation element. Usually though, again, this is pretty straightforward in intentional torts. So next, we have to get into kind of our second element, which is our first voluntary act requirement element, which is going to be this idea of harmful or offensive contact. We have to make sure to hold the defendant liable for the intentional tort of battery that the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about harmful or offensive contact. So good news is harmful contact is actually pretty straightforward. Any contact is going to be considered harmful if it causes pain, disfigurement, or injury. I always think PDI in my head really quickly. Do we have pain, disfigurement, or injury? If we have pain, disfigurement, or injury, then the contact is harmful. So if our plaintiff winds up, right, takes his fist, say it's the bar fight scenario, right? Plaintiff winds up, puts his fist in a ball, and punches the plaintiff, and the plaintiff gets a bruised arm, right? Well, that's harmful contact, right? That's probably, if it's causing a bruise, it's probably causing pain, right? You get punched in the arm hard, there's going to be pain there, and a bruise is going to be injury, right? It's like soft tissue damage. I'm sure the medical people know like the proper term for that, but it's some sort of like soft tissue injury when your skin is bruising, right? There's an underlying injury there. There's inflammation, whatever it is, right? Someone can let me know in the comments what that is when you get a bruise, but that is some kind of injury, right? So even in our kind of just classic battery fact pattern where we see someone punching another person, that's harmful contact. It's causing pain and injury. Okay, so disfigurement would be like in the situation where we have a surgeon, right, who's doing something while maybe our plaintiff is unconscious and not feeling pain, and maybe does something that doesn't necessarily cause injury, but does cause disfigurement. And usually disfigurement and injury go hand in hand. It's hard to draw up a fact pattern or example where we have disfigurement but no injury. But maybe if it was something more cosmetic, you know, some slip of the scalpel, or not even a slip of the scalpel, but going past consent, right? You have consent to do work on, you know, one ear, but the doctor does consent, you know, the problem exists in both ears, and the patient's consented to the operation on one ear but not the other, and the doctor just goes ahead and does both ears at the same time. And even though the patient's asleep and he's healing the problem, so it's not really going to be, you know, pain because the patient is asleep, right? The patient's under anesthesia, so he can't feel pain. And maybe it's not injury because maybe the doctor's actually fixing the ear. But say in doing so it leaves a scar or something, well then we get disfigurement, right? So that contact would also be harmful. It's causing disfigurement to our patient who's passed out asleep, right? Because now he's got this scar on his ear that maybe he didn't want, okay? So harmful contact, though, pretty straightforward. Usually it's like the bar fight situation. Someone gets punched or they get hit with an object, they get, you know, a weapon used against them that makes contact that results in injury. Usually with these things we have injury, though, when the contact is harmful. So anything like that where our defendant is causing or is a substantial factor and bringing about contact that brings about some sort of injury, this element's going to be easily satisfied. Okay, where it gets a little bit more interesting is where this idea of offensive contact. We also say that a defendant can be held liable for the intentional tort of battery if the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about offensive contact. So what is offensive contact? Well, the most kind of like recent definition we get is from the third restatement of torts, which tells us contact is offensive if it violates the plaintiff's reasonable sense of personal dignity. So this is kind of like a more objective test because we have this idea of reasonable sense of personal dignity. And if we look at the case law and we look at, okay, what cases do we have out there where courts have said this contact is offensive? You kind of get two different forms of offensive contact. You get this idea of basically what I would characterize as very disrespectful contact. This would be like spitting in someone's face, right? Or, you know, blowing smoke from a cigarette in someone's face, you know, spitting at them, blowing smoke at them, you know, doing something that, you know, is just meant to be a sign of like egregious disrespect. And oftentimes when we're dealing with that form of offensive contact, it really comes down to the delivery. You know, what state of mind was the defendant in when they're doing this? You know, if the defendant's angry and is trying to make a statement, that's going to be more indicative of harmful or offensive contact rather. You know, that's going to be more indicative of a violation of a plaintiff's reasonable sense of personal dignity. If you get into an argument with someone and to make your point, you spit on them, right? You spit in their face, or, anything like that. That would be kind of this reasonable sense of personal dignity being violated, because it's kind of in the heat of the moment, and the defendant's intent there is really to make a statement, to really try to violate their dignity, right? If I'm just talking, on the other hand, right, if I'm just talking and I accidentally spit on somebody, right, that's not going to be offensive. It's also not going to satisfy the intent requirement, but it's not even really going to be considered offensive because the delivery isn't there. When you read the opinions, courts really do look at the kind of underlying delivery from the defendant. What's the purpose behind this contact? So if I'm just talking, I accidentally spit on someone, that's not going to be a violation of a person's reasonable sense of personal dignity. But if I'm in an argument, I'm angry at this person, and I intentionally spit on them to show just a sign of disrespect that I just hate you this much, that's where it can become offensive. So the same type of contact can kind of change from being offensive or not offensive depending on the delivery, right? When we're kind of in that vector of just like disrespectful actions a defendant might take. And notably though, spitting on someone is never harmful. That's not really, I shouldn't say never. It's possible that could cause pain, disfigurement, or injury. I guess if you spit on someone and it hit them in the eye and it blinded them, okay, that could be injury. But generally, if you just spit on someone, it's not really going to cause pain, disfigurement, or injury. It's not necessarily harmful, but in the right context, it could be offensive, right? If it violates the plaintiff's reasonable sense of personal dignity. Okay, so that's kind of one form of offensive contact I would be looking out for. It's anything that's just really disrespectful, where the defendant's delivery is also kind of meant to be really disrespectful. That's where we get offensive contact. Also, kind of another clear-cut version of offensive contact would just be unwanted sexual advances, right? If a defendant gives the plaintiff an unwanted kiss, even an unwanted hug in certain contexts, this could be offensive, right? Any type of unwanted sexual advance, unwanted kissing, unwanted groping, unwanted hugging, unwanted, any kind of sexually motivated contact that's not wanted pretty much is going to be considered offensive. That's going to be a violation of the plaintiff's reasonable sense of personal dignity. So again, we kind of get two forms here. We get this just really disrespectful contact, like spitting on someone, and you get unwanted sexual advances. Both can be examples of offensive contact where the plaintiff's reasonable sense of personal dignity is being violated. Another important note to make here when we're thinking about harmful and offensive contact in terms of the intentional tort of battery is that the plaintiff need not be conscious of either the contact or its harmful or offensive nature at the time of the intrusion. So this is a huge difference from assault. When we get to assault, we'll see that the plaintiff is going to have to perceive that harmful or offensive contact is about to happen. In other words, when we get to assault, we'll see that the plaintiff really has to be conscious and aware of what's going on. With the intentional tort of battery, the plaintiff need not be conscious of either the contact or its harmful or offensive nature at the time of the intrusion. So if a person is passed out on the ground and you go up and spit on that person to be really disrespectful to that person, right, that could still be considered offensive contact, even though the plaintiff in that scenario might not be aware that it's even happening. Doesn't matter. For purposes of battery, the plaintiff need not be conscious or aware of either the contact or its harmful or offensive nature at the time of the intrusion. Okay, so that's kind of our second element, takes us to our third element. The intentional tort of battery occurs when the defendant causes or is a substantial factor in bringing about harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff's person. So this idea of the plaintiff's person, or if you hear this worded as the person of another, it's kind of a legal term of art, and all it means is the plaintiff's person, or if you hear the person of another, that just includes anything connected to the plaintiff. So, you know, if our defendant goes up to an old guy walking with a cane, right? He's using a cane to assist him in walking, and our defendant kicks that cane out from under the old guy, right? Doesn't make contact with the human being. The old guy is not actually touched by our defendant. The cane that he's holding is what is touched. Is that a battery? And yes, we would say, look, the cane is attached or connected to the plaintiff. So when that contact being made to the cane still counts as contact to the plaintiff's person, because the plaintiff's person includes anything connected to the plaintiff. So this would be things like clothing, it could be like a bag connected to someone, a cane connected to someone, any object connected to the plaintiff. If that's what's being contacted and then it results in the harmful or offensive contact, it's still battery, right? So it's basically just expanding the scope. It doesn't have to be body-to-body contact. Anything connected to the plaintiff could still be sufficient for the intentional tort of battery, which takes us to our last element, which is intent. Of course, we're thinking about the intentional tort of battery. All of this has to be done with intent, right? The intentional tort of battery occurs when the defendant causes or a substantial factor in bringing about harmful or offensive contact to the plaintiff's person with the intent to bring about harmful or offensive contact to another. And I have a star here drawn on harmful or offensive contact. So intent with battery can be a little bit confusing, right? But we can just start with it and then we can get into some examples. If we look at the third restatement of torts and the majority of courts, third restatement of torts and majority of courts only require intent to cause contact that society defines as harmful or offensive. In other words, there is no requirement that the defendant intends to harm or cause offense. This is super important, right? So an issue that courts have had to grapple with when we're thinking about battery and we're thinking about that intent requirement for battery, the question often becomes, well, what level of intent is actually required? Is it enough if our defendant intends to make any contact? If our defendant makes any contact with the plaintiff and has intent to make contact, if that contact ultimately results in harm, should that plaintiff be able to recover against that defendant? Should that defendant be liable? Even though the defendant may not have had any intent to harm, if the intendant had the intent to cause the contact that results in harm, is that enough to hold the defendant liable? And so we see there, take for example, a simple fact pattern. Say that I am walking along and I see in front of me a person has dropped their wallet on the ground. So being a good Samaritan, I run up, I grab the wallet, and I tap the person who dropped their wallet on the shoulder to let them know, hey, to get their attention, hey, you dropped this, you might want it back, right? If I do that and I tap that person just so gently on the shoulder to get their attention, I just give them a little tiny tap with my finger, just barely touch them, right? And then out of nowhere, unbeknownst to me, say this person, this plaintiff, has a pre-existing shoulder injury, right? And I re-injure it when I do this. My light touch, this little tap I give on the shoulder, re-injures their shoulder, right? So now I, the defendant, have caused or am a substantial factor in bringing about harmful contact to the plaintiff's person. I satisfied these first three elements, right? Absolutely, I am the legal cause in bringing about harmful contact to the plaintiff's person. So whether or not I'm liable for this battery is going to come down to intent. And if we defined intent as, look, if the defendant intended to make any contact, and ultimately that contact becomes harmful, then he's liable for battery. Then in that fact pattern, I would be liable for battery, right? So because I intended to cause the contact, I intended to reach out with my hand and tap this person on the shoulder. So if that was our standard, then in that fact pattern, I could be held liable for battery. And basically the third restatement of torts and majority of courts have basically said that they don't think that would be the correct outcome in that situation. So they kind of take it a little bit further with their definition of what intent is. But of course the question is, if that can't be the standard, if we can't say, okay, well, if you intend any contact and then that contact ends up being harmful, then you're liable for battery, should it be purely subjective? The alternative is we could just say, okay, well, let's look at what was in the defendant's head. If the defendant intended to cause harm, then he should be liable, right? If he didn't intend to cause harm or offense, then okay, he's acting in good faith. Let's say he's not liable for battery. Well, what's the problem here? Say that we have a parent who hits their kid, right? Their kid is acting out, wants to discipline the kid, so the parent strikes the kid with their hand or whatever, slaps the kid, and this kid has injury. Say it breaks the child's arm. Okay, and then we get to court. Is that parent liable for battery? Well, again, the first three elements are going to be easy to show, right? The parent was the cause in bringing about harmful contact to the plaintiff's person. So it comes down to what that parent's intent is, and so, or what that parent's intent was at the time they striked the child. So there, the problem is the parent might say, whoa, 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 look, I did not have any intent to cause harm here to my child. I was just trying to discipline the child. Subjectively, in my own head, I didn't mean to cause any harm to my kid. I was just trying to discipline them. Well, if we were applying this intent requirement, saying, look, it's all about the subjective intent of what was in the person's head, then that parent would not be liable. They would escape liability, even though probably most people looking at that would say, hey, look, if you're hitting your kid hard enough that it's causing injury, you should probably be held liable for that, right? That's abusive. We can't have that. But if the test was purely subjective and that parent honestly did believe in their head that they weren't causing harm, they didn't mean to cause harm, they were not intending to cause harm to the kid, then they could escape liability. So courts have basically said, third restatement and majority of courts don't want that result either. So what we end up with is kind of a compromise between the two. We don't want the Good Samaritan tapping someone lightly to be held accountable or held liable for battery, and we don't want the parent who hits their kid to be able to say, oh, I didn't mean to hurt him, and escape liability. So we end up with something in between, where we say the third restatement of torts and majority of courts only require intent to cause contact that society defines as harmful or offensive, right? There is no requirement that the defendant intends to harm or cause offense. So here what we're looking at is a more objective definition of this term we use in a subjective test, right? Which I know can be a little bit complicated. But what we're looking at here is we're thinking about whether or not the defendant had the intent to bring about harmful or offensive contact to another. What we're really saying is, did the defendant have the intent to bring about contact that society defines as harmful or offensive? At least this is the third restatement of torts approach and what the majority of courts are going to adhere to. So we look at that contact and we say, would that intended contact, and we say, would society define this as harmful or offensive? So take the Good Samaritan tapping the shoulder hypo. Right there, society probably wouldn't define that as harmful, right? Typically, the ordinary person probably expects as they go out into the world that they're going to be touched by people. You kind of can't get around this. If you go out into public eventually you're going to be touched by people in daily life. You're going to be bumped into people in crowded spaces. People might need to get your attention and touch you. You might get brushed by the waiter or waitress, right? Whatever. You're going to be touched as you go out into society. So society would probably not define the intent to tap someone lightly to get their attention as harmful or offensive. So in that fact pattern, we would say, okay, because society doesn't define that intended contact as harmful or offensive, then this defendant, that Good Samaritan tapping the shoulder, is not liable for battery because he didn't have the intent to bring about contact that society defines as harmful or offensive. Flip side, if we look at the parent who hits their child, right? That parent might say, hey, look, I didn't mean to cause harm here. My intent was not to harm. My intent was to discipline. I didn't think my child would be harmed. In that case, we would look at, well, does society define that as harmful contact? Thank you so much for watching this video preview of our Legal Education Accelerator Program, or LEAP for short. If you would like to see the conclusion of this video and gain full access to our entire 1L and 2L video library, integrated outlines, streamable audio versions, additional practice exams with explanations, and much more, we invite you to head over to our website and join the thousands of law students who have already enrolled. To get started with your no-risk free trial today, simply click the link in the description box below or visit www.studicata.com/leap.
Hi everyone, my name is Serena and I'm currently a law student at South Texas College of Law, Houston.
Hi everybody, my name is Shiva and I'm currently a law student at Southwestern.
Hi everyone, my name is Michelle and I am a first year student at South Texas College of Law, Houston. I used the Studicata study video series last semester to help me prepare mostly for contracts, and I actually made an A+ in contracts last semester, which I greatly dedicate to the Studicata videos.
By using Studicata to help me prepare for my final exam, I was able to score the highest grade out of my class on the final and even have my essay distributed as the model answer. Not to mention I had done quite poorly on the midterm and was struggling throughout the whole course of the semester, understanding the material and keeping up with lectures.
Because of the Studicata video lectures, I was able to go into my exams with a feeling of confidence. I didn't have to worry about what the rules of law were or how I was going to organize my answer to an essay question.
I would absolutely recommend the Studicata series and their online course materials to anyone. I think that they are not like professor lectures that you might find online or other outside study materials that you may encounter. I think that the Studicata videos really focus on not only ensuring that you understand the material that you're going to encounter on your final, but they also help you to understand kind of the best method for test taking, and they really break down how to approach each problem and the best ways to tackle certain methods on testing, and I think that's really important, and I think it's really special. I don't see that anywhere else in any of the other online resources that I've found. So I would certainly recommend Studicata to anyone who is studying in law school right now. Good luck on your studying and you're going to do great.
I would definitely recommend Studicata to anybody watching this video. Give it a chance. I'm positive that you will love it, that you will get a lot out of it, and that you will be happy that you gave it a chance. I definitely am. I know I will be using Studicata in the future.
And I cannot thank Studicata enough for getting me through my first semester of law school. I will definitely continue to watch the Studicata video lectures throughout my law school career, and I highly recommend that any future or current law student do the same.